In the Season 1 finale of Lower Decks, the USS Titan, a Lunar-class starship, was finally canonised, with its first on-screen appearance in Trek. But while it is a fan favourite, the Lunar class is not without its controversies, as my own members' Discord will attest to. Many vigorous discussions have been had about the Lunar class and its place within the wider fleet. It's a very strange ship, being a late addition to the anti-Borg fleet, and it seems really quite disruptive to other ships like the Akira and the Vesta class. So what this leads us to then ask is then, what is the Lunar for? And in order to answer that question, we must of course ask, what the is the Lunar class? But before we can answer that question, let's take a little trip to Deep Space Nine.
That's 1 for you, 10 for me. 1 for you and 10 for me. 1 for you and 10 for...
Quark! What are you doing?
I'm just counting my profits, Nagus.
Well, cut that out. I've got something far more important to talk to you about.
What is it?
It's Raid Shadow Legends!
What's that?
Quark, you imbecile! Raid is a free-to-play game with console-quality graphics on Android and iOS!
What are...
Shut up, Quark! Here are my top 3 reasons why you should play Raid. It's a turn-based strategy game with a vast selection of over 600 champions for you to choose from, all with unique visual designs and abilities. Take your team of champions into the PvP arena to mine their sweet salt, or win profit by taking on the dungeons.
But how will this help me stop Rom forming a union?
If you'll just wait, I'll tell you. Raid features extremely addictive and engrossing gameplay as you constantly fine-tune your team of champions to achieve perfect synergy in order to win. And it's constantly updated, so there's always new content to dive into and new champions to acquire. Call of the Arbiter is in full swing, so it's the perfect time to jump in.
Who's the Arbiter?
How should I know? Download the game and find out for yourself. To celebrate this epic limited series, Raid is adding new characters from the series' champions that you can play in-game. Just log into Raid for 7 days between now and July 24th, and you'll unlock Artak, the mighty Orc Warlord. If you use the link in the description or scan the QR code, you'll get a whole bunch of bonuses, including the epic champion Talia. She reminds me of that sassy redhead Bajoran major of yours.
There are females?
Of course there are, Quark! So what are you waiting for? Scan the QR code or click the link below and start playing Raid today. And Quark! That means you.
Okay, let's take a closer look at the Lunar class. We have a lot of very interesting traits on display here. For starters, the most obvious thing is that it has a Sovereign style saucer, an elliptical saucer. It also has a very thick saucer rim, more than 2 decks tall. That's the standard depth of a saucer rim, but proportional to the overall size of the Lunar class, the saucer rim is quite thick. It makes up a considerable amount of the kind of the silhouette of the ship. We also have a merged secondary hull, a lot like the Intrepid class. There's also, of course, some visual callbacks there to the Nebula class. Interestingly, though, it actually has less internal volume than an Akira class. If you look at an Akira, the saucer is substantially bigger for one, and deeper, but also the 2 pylons, while they seem thin, they're actually not. The catamaran-style pylons are actually quite thick and house quite a lot of usable volume. So all told, the Akira is actually substantially bigger than the Lunar class. It actually shares the same kind of nacelles as the other anti-Borg ships, but these ones are a little bit different. They appear to be encased to protect the nacelles. It also seems like it has a far more armoured saucer. There's a lot of plates. If you look down at the dorsal surface of the saucer, there's a lot of plating there, which there isn't on the Akira. And then finally we also see that it has a very distinctive dorsal module. Right, so with that in mind, let's try and work out exactly what the Titan's place in the fleet was, because it's not necessarily that apparent, and as I say, many people have gotten into arguments about exactly what the Luna is meant to do. So let's take a look at the anti-Borg fleet. We have the Defiant and the Steamrunner, who operate as the close-range brawlers. They're heavily armoured and have the ability to hang in a fight far longer than any other ship. With the Sovereign and the Sabre, we see a bit more of a well-rounded armament. We see a good combination of phasers and torpedoes, designed to really maneuver and fight at mid-range. They're moderately armoured ships. And then we get to the Akira and Norway class, both of which are lightly armoured and designed to fight at long range. The Akira, with its absurd overkill of a torpedo complement and torpedo launchers, and the Norway with its Lance phaser designed to poke holes in a Borg cube. Now, what you will notice is that, in terms of fighting the Borg, this is all very well and jolly. But as a fleet, it's very specialised towards that particular job. And it is, as a result, quite deficient in other areas, like in electronic warfare, like in reconnaissance. And this is because, against the Borg, it's not really the most necessary thing. It's pretty easy to spot a Borg cube from quite a long way away, and the fog of war isn't really much of an issue with the Borg, because they're only ever going to be sending a few cubes at the time, if that. And again, when it comes to electronic warfare, well, electronic warfare is good at disrupting communications between ships. But if the Borg are only sending one ship to attack you, it's not really that worthwhile. However, when you start facing an opponent like the Dominion, who is using swarm-based tactics and strategies, well, suddenly these capabilities become not just applicable, but necessary. If you've got an enemy which has a very, very large fleet capable of dispersing over a very wide area, you need good reconnaissance assets. Similarly, if they are attacking you in large-scale formations, then a good way to impair their effectiveness is going to be by disrupting their communications, which is where electronic warfare comes in. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the Federation's pre-existing electronic warfare and reconnaissance capabilities. It's a pretty short list. We have the Oberth class, which were used as communications ships in both Borg attacks. Mixed results there. And also did see use as part of, again, AWACS units and other kind of electronic warfare capacities during the Dominion War. You then have the Nova class, which is basically the newer version of the Oberth, and a lot tougher and a little bit less fragile, shall we say. And then finally we have the Nebula class, which is nice, but expensive. So obviously the drawback for the Oberth class is that it's very, very fragile, especially by 24th century standards. They were kind of glass cannons when they came out in the 23rd century, and it's even worse in the 24th century. If an enemy destroyer or skirmish unit gets a whiff of an Oberth, they will hunt it down, and it only takes one shot to take it out, basically. The Nova's great. The Nova is well armed, it's got 2 torpedo launchers and plenty of phaser arrays, it's pretty maneuverable, it's relatively well protected, but there's only relatively limited numbers of them, and they're still pretty small. If a Jem'hadar fighter starts pursuing a Nova class, it can handle that. If a Cardassian Ryzalak or a Breen frigate shows up, then it's in trouble and it's going to have to leg it out of there. It's primarily a science ship, not a warship. And then, of course, the big problem with the Nebula is that it's slow. It's very, very, very slow and heavy. Now, in terms of a general fleet action where you're all just, going in at once into a big giant melee, Nebula is excellent to have, and its electronic warfare capacity is very useful. You're pairing it up with other Galaxy-class ships, and if you are using your electronic warfare dish to disrupt local enemy communications, then in so doing, you're going to make it even easier for the Galaxies to break through. And again, this is a Nebula class. There's very little actually out there that can go toe-to-toe with it in a straight-up fight. So, good, but big, slow, awkward. So, we can see that there's actually quite a few deficiencies in the Federation's electronic warfare capabilities. And so, in order to correct this, Starfleet issued a requirement for a light cruiser able to support aggressive reconnaissance capabilities, which is basically doing reconnaissance and not running away at the first sign of trouble. The enemy tends to take exception to you nosing around the place and will generally do something about it. But if you have something larger in play, well, the enemy's going to have to dedicate more resources to chasing you off. It's also there to provide electronic warfare coverage in both skirmish and general fleet actions, and it's also going to be needed to counter the enemy's own electronic warfare efforts. To satisfy this requirement, Starfleet produces the Lunar class, basically taking a lot of the design elements of the anti-Borg ships, but adapting it into a less of a direct combat ship and more of a, like I say, reconnaissance and support vessel. Still an admittedly impressive and imposing vessel in its own regard. So the Lunar class is 450 meters long. That's 10 meters longer than an Akira, though as I previously mentioned, the Akira has substantially more mass. But it is more armoured than the Akira, which is quite interesting, and that's largely because the Lunar is going to be expected to operate independently, unlike a lot of the anti-Borg ships, which were designed to operate specifically in the anti-Borg fleet. And as a result, a lot of them are very hyper-specialised, and they rely on one another to counteract a lot of their weaknesses. The only ship where that isn't really the case is the Sabre and the Sovereign, because those are the two sort of general workhorse vessels in their own classes. Of course, the Sovereigns are much more expensive, but you see what I mean. So most of the rest of that fleet is very, very specialised, and is always going to be supported by other classes that can compensate for their weaknesses. But in open order reconnaissance and general skirmishing, the Lunar just has to rely on itself, and as a result it needs to be relatively capable of dealing with pretty much whatever shows up, whether that's a number of smaller ships or a single larger ship coming after it. And so that's why it's actually more armoured, because it's expected to operate independently. They are very strategic with how they place the armour. Most of the armour is placed on the saucer section, and then similarly, the engines, the warp engines, are actually armoured, because that's the first thing the enemy is going to shoot at when you're dealing with a fast reconnaissance vessel. You clip its wings, and you make sure that it can't get away. So again, that's why those engines see additional protection. In terms of its armament is really quite unremarkable. We have one large dorsal phaser array, 3 ventral phaser arrays on the underside of the saucer, and then another ventral phaser array on the engineering hull. Nothing all that much to shout about, really. Similarly with the torpedoes, okay, it's got a fair number of launchers. You've got 4 prow launchers and 3 aft launchers. It's a decent amount, but by Dominion War standards, it's hardly decisive. And also, most of these torpedo launchers are probably not always going to be used as torpedo launchers, bearing in mind the role of the Lunar class. At least some of these torpedo launchers are actually going to be used as probe launchers, again, in aid of its mission of reconnaissance. In terms of its own armament, it's more for just self-defense and supporting other ships, rather than it forming the vanguard itself. It is really devoted to reconnaissance and electronic warfare. That is what it is designed to do, and in that role, it is very effective. As I previously mentioned, the rim of the lunar saucer is a lot thicker than other ships. And the reason for that is because that saucer rim is actually home to the ship's main sensor array. It's a pretty large and pretty well-furnished sensor array with a wide variety of different sensor suites that it's employing. There's very little that the Luna does not see. Additionally, you also have the dorsal pod, which contains most of the ship's electronic warfare capabilities as well. All said, it is really devoted towards reconnaissance and electronic warfare, whether that is offensive electronic warfare in order to disrupt the enemy's communications, or defensive in order to basically shore up their own lines of communication within the fleet in a general action when jamming will be something that the enemy is going to be trying, especially the Cardassians. Cardassians love a little bit of jamming, because the Cardassian strategy is generally just stay put in one place and shoot. It's the Dominion that do all the complex and exciting maneuvers that require all their ships to be well in tune, so they are much more vulnerable to electronic warfare than their Cardassian allies. So, speaking of which, let's now talk about the implementation of the Luna class into the war. So, it began deploying in mid-2375. As soon as the wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant was discovered, the idea of creating a ship that was capable of exploring the Gamma Quadrant, bearing in mind all the dangers that likely presented, because we're not talking about a naive Starfleet at this point, was already on the table. And then as the Dominion threat began to build, the goalposts of the design kind of shifted and a lot of the systems that were put in to make it an explorer were kind of reworked to put it into this more combat-oriented role, but not direct combat, because this is still an exploratory vessel at the end of the day, and built as such. It's not built in the same way as things like the Steamrunner and Defiant. And then when they were introduced in the latter half of 2375, they were basically held back because of the Breen threat. So the Federation were about to go on the offensive, they were beginning to gain ground in the Chintoka front, and then the Breen come in and counterattack, and then Starfleet is basically pulling everything back, especially their most valuable ships, and especially a ship like the Luna class, which is very, very, very new and very, very valuable. So they hold the Luna in reserve, really, until they're ready to go forward. So the result is that actually the Luna doesn't see action until the final phase of the war with the invasion of Cardassia, at which point there are about 8 Lunas in service. And they would serve in aggressive reconnaissance units for the Battle of Cardassia Prime and the Frontier campaign. And of course, post-war, the Luna actually did what it was originally intended to do, which was be a general-purpose explorer with anti-Borg qualities. You know, as I say, most of the other anti-Borg ships found themselves relatively confined in what they could do in a peacetime setting, but the Luna actually takes to it very well because that was what it was originally designed for. Whereas all the other anti-Borg ships, you know, again, with the exception of the Sovereign class, pretty much, were designed primarily for tactical purposes. So let's end on this question. We have several ships coming here protesting that the Luna took my job. This includes the Intrepid, Akira, and Vesta classes. Let's evaluate these claims. So let's go first with the Akira. Did the Luna take its jab? Well, no. In a wartime setting, the Luna is not a satisfactory torpedo gunboat, and it was never intended to be such. In that respect, the Akira is perfectly secure in its job, as is the Akira as a fighter launching platform. Yes, the Luna has a large shuttle bay, only about as large as the Sovereign's shuttle bay. The only real way in which the Luna steals the Akira's thunder is in an appearance. It does have a very similar aesthetic to the Akira class, though perhaps Akira should consider that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. Next claimant is the Intrepid class. The Intrepid class claims that the Luna took its job both in aggressive reconnaissance capacities and as a peacetime explorer. This has a little bit more credence. The Intrepid is itself quite a general purpose, well-rounded vessel, largely oriented towards exploration, but perfectly capable of handling itself in a fight, and it was used pretty consistently during the Dominion War. But the Intrepid was built as an explorer, so it was built with that goal primarily in mind. There's a lot of similar systems between them in terms of sensor arrays and such, but they're implemented in very different ways. The Luna implements them with a far more tactically inclined view. The Intrepid implements them with a mind towards exploration, and there's some overlap in those jobs, but they're from different eras of technology. Intrepid is fundamentally a child of the Galaxy class. It's a child of the Golden Age Starfleet. The Luna is a child of the anti-Borg Starfleet. So again, they're similar, and there's probably a good argument to be had that they are fighting for a role, they are competing, but they can each have their own slice of the pie. There's enough to go around there. The final claimant, and perhaps most puzzling claimant of all, is the Vesta class, who claims that the Luna took its job as a science ship. As I previously mentioned, the Luna is more tactically inclined than other dedicated science ships. The only reason I can see that this claim was made is that the Luna is a large ship that is specialized towards scientific missions. With that all being said, again, there's a difference. The Luna has that capability, yes, and a lot of its equipment and systems were intended for that. But as I said before, these systems had been adjusted to serve the Luna in a much more tactical environment. The Vesta isn't. The Vesta is a long-range science ship and actually has an awful lot in common with designs like the Crossfield. Big, giant science ships that go off and do really in-depth planetary surveys and such for months, if not years on end. And it's not like the Galaxy class or the Intrepid class have any patience for that kind of thing. They, those ships will generally show up, take some pictures, move on because they're in demand. Again, the Luna, it's got some similar capacities, but the Vesta is a newer ship. It's got the same capacities as the Luna, and even more. And it is so much more specialized towards a scientific mission than the Luna. So to claim that the Luna took its jib is preposterous, as it is with any of these ships, really. The Luna fits a very, very particular niche, particularly in wartime. In peacetime, yes, there can be arguments made that it's treading on the toes of other classes. But it was created largely for a wartime role, or for a wartime contingency. It was created with the expectation that a war may happen and they should be prepared for it. And that is that very niche role of aggressive reconnaissance. You infiltrate enemy territory, you investigate enemy assets, you test their defenses, and then you get out of there. And none of these other ships are really capable of doing it as effectively as the Luna is. Yes, the Intrepid has got all these sensor systems, but it doesn't have those electronic warfare systems. It can't jam the enemy sensors and communications the way that the Luna can, and in so doing, the Luna is far more capable than any of these ships in making a clean getaway, and that was really the whole point of the ship to begin with. And so really to round up, while the Luna class is not as prolific as other ships, it was built in relatively limited numbers before production ended, partially as a result of the Dominion War ending, but they still carried on a little bit later. But ultimately, a new wave of technology would come after the Dominion War and begin sort of outcompeting the anti-Borg ships that the Luna was fundamentally a part of. So despite its late entry and low numbers, it achieved disproportionate effects in the war and was definitely a pretty key element to the Allies' victory. The first step in a successful plan is good intelligence, and the Luna was exceptionally good at providing good intelligence. And so I think that really answers what the Lunar class is. A ship that was intended for exploration, that was repurposed during the design process to a wartime role, but after that wartime role came to an end, it was able to seamlessly slide into its peacetime role as a dedicated exploration and science vessel. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring the video. I am very, very honored. I'm genuinely honored to have them as a sponsor. Thank you, Raid, for recognizing me and allowing me to join that exclusive club of YouTubers that are sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. So make sure you scan the QR code or click the link in the description. Do one of the two. Download Raid, get playing Raid, and thank you guys for sponsoring this video. And I will see you all in the next video.